Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the hotel for looking after me so well today, not just in this delicious dinner, but also allowing me to do the LBC broadcast earlier on. It's been so kind and helpful, and it's a real privilege to be here. I'd also like to thank the Remainers for coming, because I so agree this party has to be a broad church that is not ideologically purist. We're not Marxists, we're Conservatives, and we should welcome honest debate within the party. So those of you who backed Remain, I particularly thank you for coming, because you probably know what you're going to get, and you may not enjoy it, but you are brave souls and important members of the party. It is my particular pleasure to be supporting Andrew, who is a brilliant Member of Parliament. You know how well this constituency has done with him as the parliamentary candidate and then member. The 58% plus of the vote that is now Conservative in what was a Labour seat. The phenomenal success of this area economically and his leadership in that. It is a quite remarkable success story. And he has made a name for himself at Westminster by being fearless, outspoken and courageous, even courageous enough to be the first, and I think only person so far, to say that I should take over as leader of the party. So he's not always right. But he is certainly always brave. So it's a real privilege to be supporting him and his association in raising funds. And he very kindly came to my association about a year ago, which was an absolute triumph. So you are generous to lend your Member of Parliament out to other associations for the good of the party. So thank you for having me. I asked one or two tables whether I should talk about Brexit or the 1974 reform of county councils. By and large, there was more appetite for Brexit than county council reform, which surprised me a little. But what I wanted to do was to remind us of why we voted to leave, talk about where we are at the moment, and then think about the benefits of leaving. Because I think these get forgotten in the minutiae, in the detail, in the weeds of the negotiation. So why did we vote to leave? What was it about? What was the fundamental thing that meant 17.4 million of our fellow citizens voted to leave? But you know, I think it's based on what makes the Conservative Party tick and what underpins the basic principle of our party. And that is that we believe in a society that is built from the bottom up. You see this with this fantastic association and the work that you've done to get Andrew elected. How have you done that? By one, knocking on doors, but then coming together as a society, as a community that works together to produce a Member of Parliament who then goes to Westminster, who then gets involved in the government of the country. It's a completely bottom-up process, democratically controlled. And that underpins conservatism. We believe that individuals know better how to lead their lives than the state knows how to lead their life for them. But the EU is a bureaucracy which thinks it knows how to lead our lives better for us, and where, because of its system, laws can only be introduced by the bureaucracy, and they are not subject to accountability to the democratic arm, or at least not to Parliament, and therefore you cannot seek redress of grievance. If something goes wrong and it's a European competence, that is the law, and that is done. And we were voting to overturn that, to take back control. But why take back control? What is it that underpins our faith in democracy? And here I think it's important to look at the historic debates around democracy. Because the modern world tends to think of democracy as being an end in itself. It is a good thing that people should vote. But the reason societies became democratic was because they came to the conclusion that democracy led to the best form of government. It was a means to an end, not an end in itself. That having that accountability, the right of redress of grievance, the flexibility that democracy brings, with the protection of minorities that usually goes with it as well, meant that it was a better form of government than any form of totalitarianism, autocracy or bureaucracy. Hence, taking back control is important as a means to the end of good government, which we weren't getting from the European Union, which had become arbitrary and bureaucratic and not subject to redress of grievance. And that's important to remember why we are here. And then to think about where precisely we are, at which point somebody in the audience can shout. If you don't know, you really ought to. But, and other than in Leicestershire. But the negotiations are very hard to read from outside. We are very dependent on intermediaries, we are very dependent on leaks, we are very dependent on the broadcasters giving us an idea of where they are. And we then have to try and interpret that, and we have to try and interpret opaque or less opaque statements that come out of Her Majesty's government or the European Union. Well, let me deal with a less opaque statement for the moment, that of Mr. Tusk, who says that there is a special place of hell, as the chairman mentioned. That non-opaque statement is a reminder that they don't actually like us. And that is quite a useful reminder, because it means there are forces within Brussels that want a punishment Brexit. And that militates against a deal, because we cannot agree to anything, any terms they lay down. We have to recognise that the motives of some of them are not those you would expect of friends and long-time allies. They are those of almost a religious sect that is trying to deal with a heretic who is trying to escape. Like if you're trying to get out of some of those sects that I'd better not mention because they're terribly litigious, and then they come after you once you've tried to leave. So there is a...
You mean the Labour Party?
I don't know, I think they're quite pleased to get rid of some of that. The deselection process goes on. So that is an indication of the difficulty of the negotiations. But I think the member states are more sensible. I think the member states broadly want an agreement because they are themselves facing such trouble. It is really important today that the French ambassador to Rome has been recalled. It hasn't got the coverage that you would expect, but do you know the last time the French ambassador to Rome was recalled? 1940.
Yeah.
You know what was happening in 1940? Friendly nations do not recall their ambassadors. This is an incredibly extreme diplomatic step. It's what you do with countries that you're in a state of some degree of hostility with. And for France and Italy to be in that state shows you that something is wrong. If you look at the EU's approach to Italy, the EU's approach to Poland, the EU's approach to Hungary, none of those relationships is well ordered or successful. If you look at the economic situation in Italy, in France, in Germany, none of those situations is positive. And so the EU is facing great difficulties, which must put pressure on the member states for some sort of accommodation of the UK. They do not want another hit to their economies in the event of what they would call a disorderly Brexit. So that is helpful from our point of view. In a sense, Brexit is not the main game in town from a European perspective, and they are facing the prospect of European elections where Euroscepticism is likely to do very well. And for that reason, they ought to be desperate to get rid of us before the European elections, because if we are still there, I think one Tommy Robinson will do remarkably well. I don't see people voting for ordinary parties if ordinary parties have failed to deliver Brexit. So we need to be out, not just because we said we would, not just because it holds faith with the electorate, but to prevent a peculiar electoral situation arising if by the 2nd of July we have not left. So the short extension is really a dangerous prospect and would upset the British political system in a way I think would be deeply undesirable. So there is a good reason for sticking with the 29th of March beyond honour, decency and the expectations of the electorate. There is a further reason from both sides' point of view. And that, I think, does point towards the Malthouse Compromise. Now, forgive me, I am talking my own book because I was involved in these negotiations with Nicky Morgan, obviously a neighbouring MP, who I've known since Oxford days, and we've disagreed on the European Union since Oxford days. And her view is a very respectable and honest one that I just don't happen to share. But we've both been in these negotiations with others. It does things Eurosceptics really dislike. We pay £39 billion with nothing set in return. We would be in a vassal state for 33 months. But on the other hand, we would absolutely leave on the 29th of March. We would be out, and everything that we have agreed to would fade away. It has an end point, a clear end point. Whereas with the backstop currently devised, there is no end date. It could go on forever. And I wouldn't trust just adding a theoretical end date into the text, because that could be adjusted. It needs to be changed, and we've come up with proposals to change it that both sides could live with. And I'll happily take questions on the detail if people want to know. So that's the Malthouse Compromise, with fallback positions if it's rejected by the EU, that unites the party and gets us out. Do I think it's likely? Well, you would be better off asking Downing Street than me, but I think it's a run. I think it is being taken seriously. I think a great deal of effort is being made to test it and see if it works in practice. And I'm expecting that it will be offered by Stephen Barclay, the Secretary of State, to the European Union on Monday. So yes, there is a chance. And the reality, in my view, is that three things could happen. We could leave without a deal on the 29th of March, or we could leave with the Malthouse deal agreed at the last minute on the 29th of March. I think those two are currently about equally likely. Alternatively, we could not leave at all. I think that is very unlikely, and by that I include a postponement. Very unlikely, but not impossible, and very risky for the reasons I set out. So that's where I think we are now. But let me remind you of the opportunities. Because why are we doing this? Are we doing it because we are stiff-necked people who don't like being in the European Union? No. We're doing it because we have seen that the European Union is a failed economic model. A model that holds back society, holds back the economy, holds back prosperity. What do I mean by that? How does it do that? Where does it do that? Well, you just need to look at the euro if you don't believe me, and what it's done to Southern Europe as it's pushed an economic agenda, an uncompetitive agenda, a high-cost agenda, ahead of the interests and the livelihoods of the peoples of European states. But look what it does to this country. Look at the customs union that nobody paid any attention to before Brexit was discussed. The customs union makes prices for consumers higher. It puts on the backs of consumers the burden of subsidizing inefficient, primarily continental industries. And most of all, it hits the least well-off in society, because the biggest burdens fall on food, clothing and footwear, which are a disproportionate share of the expenditure of the least well-off in our society. So on the backs of the least well-off are the subsidies of the incumbent fat cats in continental Europe. But that's dangerous, because protectionism always is. What protectionism does is provide short-term economic activity, but over the long term it entrenches inefficiency. And it is a situation where we see the rest of the world is becoming more competitive, more open to trade, and richer. And the European Union has decided to hide itself behind a wall. The high winds that blew today are not allowed to blow in the forces of competition over this wall. They are there to be kept out, because there is a thought that the European model that was so successful until about 1900 cannot be challenged from the forces from outside. The fact that China and India and Brazil and Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore are now really prosperous nations doing better every year, competing with us, cheaper than us, more effective than us, technologically advancing to catch up with us, is to be ignored whilst we close in and look in on ourselves. Leaving the European Union gives us the freedom to move away from that. It gives us the freedom to have regulations that make us more competitive, to use data in a way that is positive for developing AI, rather than a GDPR that closes down the use of data and makes us a less competitive, less forward-looking nation. A common commercial policy that means we are reluctant to trade with other countries, not just through tariff barriers, but through non-tariff barriers as well. Fake regulations that stop other countries selling things to us to protect inefficient production here. And regulations that place burdens on new businesses so that big established businesses have a protected market share. We can get rid of that. We can move away from that, and we can look to the world as it is, not the world as it was in 1900. Now I know for me to stand here as the apostle of modernity may seem ironic, but the truth is that economics is not modern or old-fashioned. It is a reality that you have to deal with. And we know from history that free markets, open markets, competitive markets are those that lead to prosperity and, most importantly, improve the standard of the living of the least well-off faster than anybody else's. That is the economic reality through leaving the European Union. The reality of staying in it is managing decline. And one thing we should all remember from Margaret Thatcher is that managing decline is not required. It is not compulsory. It is not the British disease. It is in our own hands. And isn't it exciting, inspiring and uplifting that 17.4 million of our fellow citizens decided that they were brave enough to grasp the future in their hands. And they weren't the already well-to-do. They weren't necessarily the most highly educated, but they were the most ambitious and the most confident in their own future, in their own country, in their own abilities to make it work over the next generation. We must deliver for them. Democracy requires it. Prosperity will benefit from it. And the next 7 weeks, yes, they could go in different directions. But when we look back and see that we have left and gained these freedoms and the stronger nation that we have become, we will realize that it was right all along.